Välkomna alla Stockholms-TVs tittare. Vårt team är ute på Djurgården, närmare bestämt i Gamla Skogsinstitutet, en borgliknande byggnad på vad som förr kallades Djurgårdsberget. Och det är nu Israels ambassad. Och där möter vi Israels ambassadör, Isaac, eller Isaac Yitzhak kanske man ska säga på hebreiska, Yitzhak Bachman. Mr. Ambassador, or Your Excellency, maybe I should address you.
Isaac.
Isaac, thank you very much, Isaac. You are as informal as your predecessor, Benny Dagan. He also said immediately, call me Benny.
This is who we are, Israelis. It's not only him and me.
No, I know. We had a long discussion about that you being a country of pioneers, you have a sort of... I read only yesterday an article about your country that much of the old Central European, Russian and German culture that was brought with Yiddish language to Israel, it has been destroyed more by this pioneer spirit that is more like Australian or American attitudes. Is that correct, or?
Correct, but it combines all. You have to combine it and look at it from a different angle. Yeah. What we represent is part of the Israeli population. The other part is originally from Arab countries and from a totally different culture. So when you combine the European one with the one that Jews coming from Islamic and Arab countries brought with them, you get a great mixture. And I love our, social fabric. I think it's warm enough. It's not as official as in other countries, and still with some, level of reasonable respect to one another.
Reasonable respect. Yep. I guess so. I remember when I was young, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, they were always mentioned as being one of the most informal armies of the world. But I think that hasn't lessened their efficiency. They are still highly combat efficient.
I disagree with you. In the army, it's very strict and but I'm talking about the society.
Yeah, the society and the civil. But
the Israeli army is a mirror picture of the society, not the other way around.
No,
because it's a popular army. It's not an army of professionals.
I shouldn't argue with you. You being the expert, you being in Israeli and probably made your military service. But what I meant, and in those days, why it was considered like in a very informal and a non-military army, because things like mandatory salutes and dressing in a very formal way. I have at least been told that is...
That's not true.
That's not true.
I've been in the army, and it's an army of professionals, and in the manner it is conducted, but it's a popular army in the sense of every citizen goes to the army, but it is ran very professionally. Very professionally, and we have to salute. We have to do what you do in an army.
Okay.
And there are no discounts on the country. When you finish with high school, you go to the army, and overnight you become a soldier like any other soldier anywhere else. And even tougher than that, because our army have to deal with the real things and not only drills and excursions and theory. It's the real thing.
It's the real thing, of course. In the surroundings, the political and military surroundings you live, it's the real thing. But maybe, in a way, you misunderstood me, because I'm referring also to the other side. It's popular. Yeah. It's popular in the sense that not always the army in countries that are not in such a great need of an army, then the army and the military is not always popular, and that gives kind of negativism, which you don't have, because you have the civil support of your army.
And the reason for what you were mentioning, this is true. It is popular because it's the army of the people. Yeah. Everybody goes to the army. And every family has family members that were there, are there, or will be there. So it's very popular in the sense that it touches everyone. It's not only one in a neighborhood that goes to a professional army. This is the essence of the existence of the State of Israel.
But in a way it's fun, this, that I mentioned this misconception from the days of my youth about your military and the attitudes, because everybody knows it's a very efficient army, and it's proven its combat worth many times, in repeated times. It's probably the most combat experienced army in the world. But this is a very interesting point of exit for our discussion now. The development in the last 30, 40, 50 years of Swedish and Israeli relations.
Yes.
Because when I was young, it was considered as politically correct and very fashionable, whether you were rightist or leftist, to be pro-Israel. Everybody, people that are now in the 60s or the 70s and are in leading parties, when they were young, with their political parties, youth association, they went to Israel to go to train in a kibbutz or live in a kibbutz.
Yeah.
And Israel was so popular in Sweden in those days. What happened?
You mean,
in Sweden.
what is the reason for the change?
Yeah.
So your point of departure is that today it's not
different.
as good as it used to be.
No, I'm Swedish, but I can observe it, and maybe I should instead comment what happened in 40 years. But you've been here 5 years, what's your...
My explanation to that, the way I look at it and analyze it, is that Sweden is very much in its political concepts dominated by the Social Democratic Party. This is a party that never ceased to be the biggest in the last 100 years. I've checked it and I've seen that in all election campaigns since 1917. Since 1917 till 2018, the Social Democratic Party never ceased to be the largest, the biggest. Not for one moment the number two. It was always the number one, even when it wasn't in government. There were twice that the victory was over 50%.
Yes.
And I think 11 times over 45, and some 20 times over 40%. So it's dominantly obvious that this is almost jokingly a party that has a country. It is obvious that this party has a grip over the concepts of whole people. So I would say that as an answer, this is an entrance to the answer I want to give you. I think that in the times of the Social Democratic Party, looking at Israel as a young state being also administrated by a Social Democratic Party in Israel for almost 30 consecutive years. There was the first time change. But during these times, with the kibbutz being very successful in Israel, the most socialistic type of style of life that is working in Israel voluntarily, I think this created a special interest from socialistic Sweden to the young socialistic Israel that has patterns of social life that are so desired in Sweden, and they are successful from day one. It works. So, and I can understand the interest. I think indeed it is interesting, but I think it was a kind of idealizing a little bit too far the nature and the character and we had our ups and downs, and there were lots of loopholes in the early stages of statehood that we had, socially, economically, and in other aspects. So I think we were idealized then, and I think that slowly what happened, with Olof Palme as prime minister, and with the third way that he adopted, and with looking at all the weak, so to speak, countries and societies, be it Cuba, Vietnam, being the Palestinians, all this was idealized, and all those that stood at the other part, at the other side, namely Israel is the other side of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict coin, were depicted as the terrible aggressor. And I think that as time went by, there were, the intifada and violence from the Palestinian side towards the Israeli. We tried a few times to find a peaceful solution to this, to no avail. There was nobody to talk at the other side with the Palestinians. and the Arab world supported them, and no peace to Israel, and no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. Those three no's are known to be the three no's of the Khartoum conference. It's the Arab League a conference that took place right after the 6 Days War. So it was a war in which the Palestinians and the Arabs were defeated, but they decided immediately not to negotiate with Israel and not to try and solve this conflict peacefully. And this is the reason to why we were stuck with all these territories and all with this problem of not having a counterpart to deal with and to have peace agreements. You know, the occupation that in Sweden is viewed terribly, and we don't like it, of course. It's not a result of policies of expansionism of the state of Israel. It was a result of a self-defense war. And we are, since then, in the self-defense, trying to find a political solution, peaceful solution. And before you even get to that, you get Palestinians that are split and so on and so forth. But to go back to your question, I think that today the image of Israel is not positive in Sweden, obviously, as a result of the things I've described. Plus, I think that in both cases, then we were idealized. And I think that today we are demonized.
Yeah.
And I think those are the two extreme sides of the same coin of looking at a conflict, and then there was no conflict. There was no occupation, okay? So we were idealizing in one period of time, and we are demonized on the other. I think that today the views in Sweden of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are very, very much one-sided. And, you know, I assume that touching upon the dominance of the social democratic concepts in Sweden, I think that as to a large extent being rich and successful in Sweden is something that you have to explain yourself how you got there. I think that being strong and successful takes you as an Israeli to explain yourself. How come? But I want to remind ourselves that we are talking about the Middle East. In the Middle East, if you are a minority, as the Jews are, and as the Kurds are, and as the Christians are, and as the Yazidis are, and the Assyrians are, if you don't have the possibility to defend yourself, you just fade away.
No,
that's why
you're exterminated.
You're exterminated, and you are executed, and you are, you know, running to any place you have, and that's why you have a Sodotelia here with so many Assyrians.
I have a supplementary explanation.
And this is the reason, again, for us to be strong.
Yeah.
Because we are a minority, and you should know that all the other minorities that I mentioned look at us admiring Israel, because we are the Jewish minority that made it in the Middle East. You know, you'll be surprised to know that I, as an Israeli ambassador, I'm a keynote speaker in Sodotelia. Can you imagine?
No.
I am a keynote speaker, and I was there during the festivities of the Syrian community, coming from Syria, you know.
Yeah, I remember, I read it.
Oh, yeah, you see. So for you guys here, it would be, an Israeli ambassador with those refugees from Syria, how come? So I'll tell you how come. The reason is that they have suffered the same suffering that we suffer. They are Christians, a minority, and we are Jews, a minority. The only difference is that we don't have to run to Sweden as they did, because we have our own country, and we can defend ourselves. And this becomes, in Swedish terms, the reason for us to be demonized.
To return to the religion question, what happened with the relations, and how did they come to deteriorate in this terrible way? You, of course, have been there the last 5 years, and then already the relations weren't that fine. But how is the development during this period, you think? Worse or better?
Well, I think that the image of Israel in Sweden is not good in the last, it's deteriorating slowly. It wasn't that great before the present administration took over in October 2014. During the alliance times, There was a lot of criticism over Israel too, but of course it was the criticism was more reasonable, with less practicalities that led to votings against Israel and policies that would be obviously very anti-Israeli. I think that this government has taken it to up to the surface and is practicing policies that are described as being friendly. Namely, we're a friendly country, and this is what we think, and you should respect, and you should see it as coming from the best intentions we have. But, you know, we have some differences in that, and we run the relations. When it comes to the conflict, well, Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think that Sweden has very clear views, very one-sided, very unbalanced. It's only criticizing Israel out loud in the open, in parliament, in the UN organizations, publicly shaming, blaming, with lists of to do and not to do. We haven't heard this government criticizing the Palestinians with the same lists of to do and not to do in parliament, in the media, in the UN General Assembly, in the Security Council. The Swedish conduct when it comes to the Palestinians is very cautious, is very low key. Even the words Palestinian terror, which everybody pronounces everywhere, are not pronounced in Sweden. I've never heard any Swedish politician that refers to the dozens of events that we have of terror attacks over Israelis, sometimes per day. Sometimes it happens per day. I've never heard any government official that would refer to this as Palestinian terror. Farther than that, we have never heard an official condemnation of this terror. We hear sometimes tweets, sometimes, you know, some rumors, some things that are not official condemnation. You know, there are official ways to condemn. I've heard the Prime Minister here talking to ambassadors, I was one of them, briefing them and talking about the terrible terror in Paris and in Copenhagen and Great Britain, Spain, you know, so many countries. And not only in Europe. Israel wasn't mentioned at all. I mean, you know, we could be the world champion in being the victims of terror. Okay, it's not that we're competing with anyone. This is a competition that, God forbid, to enter into the shortlist. But we are there, and we are the #1 for decades, and we are not even mentioned. So I don't know how should Israeli feel when in Sweden there's so little attention given to the Israeli victims of terror and to the terrible and awful and obvious Palestinian terror against Israelis. Try to put yourself in the shoes of an Israeli that is listening in Tel Aviv about when we are having those dozens of attacks per day in the height of this, when there is an official statement in Sweden that blames Israel of extrajudicial executions of Palestinians. Just to remind ourselves, those Palestinians are slaughtering Jews. And when this accusation was pronounced various times, repeatedly, in Sweden itself, there was a terrible terror attack that was defined immediately as terror attack, with no doubts, of course. The Palestinian terror is not obvious, but when it happens in Sweden, it's obvious that it's terror. And it wasn't Trollhättan. You know, we had this right-wing extremist that went into this immigrants' neighborhood and school, and he killed 4 people. And he chose them for being what he thought are immigrants. Okay? And this was terror, and this was applauded by the Prime Minister and all Swedes, because the police was very successful in shooting him to death. So when it happens in Sweden, it's applaudable by the Prime Minister. When it happens in Israel, Israel is condemned. I mean, I'm getting lost here of the double standard.
Yeah, excuse me for coming. So to summarize it, you seem to think that's a very unfair treatment of Israel. There are
Do you see it differently? As I described it, do you see it differently?
No.
You or the audience can see it in a different way after my description. If you're telling me that you do, I rest my case.
What you're referring to, that different standards are used when comparing and when describing deeds and acts of terror in Europe and in Israel. It's like terror committed in Israel doesn't count. It seems like they reason like that.
Well, I would like to think that Swedes do care, but you know, we can judge only things that we read, we see, and we hear. And what we see, read, hear is next to nothing.
But couldn't it be a result of years of indoctrination and years of people are used to that terrible things happen in the Middle East, and after all, the Middle East, that's where most of the terrorists come from, and people sort of get shocked when it happens in Sweden, if only there are a few victims. But I think you've been mentioning the politicians. Isn't the Swedish media very much to blame too? The Swedish journalists, I mean, politicians are very sensitive to public opinion.
Yeah.
If they say something, it's probably because they believe that the majority of the people, their voters, have these views. And these views could have been incited, or they could have been influenced by the media. How do you regard the position of Swedish media in this conflict?
Well, you've mentioned something that most of the terrorists are coming from the Middle East. In Swedish politically correctness terms, this is a terrible accusation, but apparently it describes a reality. And I'm happy that you said it and not I. And that's very good, because it describes a reality. And I think that the terror that we suffer from with too little sympathy from Sweden is the same terror that knocks the doors of Sweden today. We have seen one terror attack in Sweden, and Sweden is preparing itself, rightly so, because this is a plague that gets to all Europe. It's not only against Israelis, it's not only against French citizens, it arrived to Sweden as well. So now to go to your question, I think that the media has a great role in all this. But as I'm saying, for me, a country that is 100 years with the dominance of a social democratic philosophy, I think this goes to every corner of the daily life in a country, be it Sweden or any other. The thing is that in the modern free world, we don't have any other case of a country, a democratic country, that has, as Sweden, the dominance of one party for so many years. And I think the dominance of this left approach, politically speaking, is also part of the media. You know, there was a survey done by a professor some 3 years back in Lund University, and he wasn't, of course, doing any survey when it comes to the approach of the media towards Israel only, but he was checking what are the political views of those involved in the Swedish media, be it journalists, be it cameramen, be it sound, all of it. And his results were that over, I think it was 82% of all are center-left voters. So, you know, in such an environment, it's very difficult to get an honest treatment of Israel. I think it's a mirror copy of the political approach that the Social Democratic Party today in government is having towards Israel.
Yeah.
The same philosophy goes to the media. And you know, if you look at the treatment we get, but by no more, no less than the official state media, it's amazing. The professionality of SVT, educational TV, and the Swedish radio are very much questioned. You know, when I see the way, the form, and the manner they cover Israel, you know, sometimes it's nothing short of a scandal. Sometimes. And when it's not a scandal, it's not balanced, okay? So there's never, an honest coverage of this conflict with honest mainstream Israelis giving the stage. When you bring those that would give the Israeli narrative, it's almost guaranteed that you'll hear the Israelis that would supply the Swedish narrative to the conflict. You have it, in Israel, this is a very pluralistic country. Much more than Swedish.
But I think the special refers to the treatment of how Swedish aid funds are used for education within the areas of the Palestinian Authority or the Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Because I met representatives of the staff of PMW, Palestinian Media Watch.
Yes.
And when they visited Sweden, they have received very little attention when they gave hard facts and proofs that abuses are made in this sector, that Palestinian children are brought up to learn to hate Israel children. Well, and this is something that is totally ignored by Swedish media.
Well, this goes along with what I've described as the Swedish approach to Israeli victims of terror and to the Palestinian terror. It's the other side of the same coin. I mean, I know the guest that was here, Itamar Marcus. He's the founder and the head of the Palestinian Media Watch organization, a very effective organization, very peaceful, just following what the Palestinians are saying. Media, politicians, and so on. When he was here, he was blamed of being a settler. Nobody dealt with the substance that he was bringing along for the Swedes to understand. And you're right. Everything that leads to the Palestinian terror is marginalized, if not ignored, in Sweden. The incitement by Palestinian TV, by Palestinian leaders, the naming of streets, main squares, and the main schools after terrorists that killed dozens of Israelis.
They become heroes.
They become heroes. The money that goes systematically to the prisoners in Israel and to their families with a simple code: more Israelis assassinated, more money the family and the perpetrator gets. All this is a full-fledged mechanism and apparatus that would support terror by the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian state in Sweden, because Sweden recognized the Palestinian state. And the Swedish government is supporting the Palestinians with what, to the best of my knowledge, it's about $114 million per year. That's okay. We have no problem with supporting the Palestinians. We want them to have the best lifestyle possible, better than ours. If they live comfortably, I think the situation would become much better. So we don't have a problem with the support that Sweden as a donor country is extending to the Palestinians. That's okay with us. But we have to make sure that this is used for the proper
reasons
and ends. When you see so much money that is dedicated to terrorism, it doesn't matter if it is your dollar that left the Swedish bank here that goes to the family of a terrorist or the terrorist itself. It's the very notion of helping such a regime without linking their practices to your money. I think that you should link when you have so much money donated to people that are in need. You are in a position to tell them, hey, that's okay. Food, garment, those are obvious, but no terror. It doesn't matter if you earmark your dollar, the Swedish dollar, the very fact that you support such a regime that does this with so much money is something that shouldn't be done. And it is Sweden and other countries that should be conditioning this support and making sure that this money would go to the, if you'll take the sums of money that are dedicated to all this Sweden could have donated much less to get the same results. There's no reason to use taxpayers' money to extend help for the wrong purposes, not only wrong purposes, but for terrorism. The same terrorism that you ignore by not even defining it as Palestinian terror.
Especially if these are
and by the way, if I may, it's not only the direct SIDA money and taxpayer money that goes to the Palestinians. You have here also in Sweden itself, Palestina Grupperna. This is an organization that gets SIDA money. And look at their website and look at all the European Palestinian organizations that are so much active. Find me one that talks about peace and cooperation with Israel. The only thing that they are talking about, BDS, shaming and naming and Israel is demon. Sweden should not support such organizations that do not bring about peace. You know, what Sweden is saying officially is, we bring about better conditions for peace, and we are very much in support of this. But look at the recognition of Palestine. Is there any result to that? There's more violence. As a result, if I would have to describe the results of the recognition, it would be not zero, unless the Swedes, for their purposes, see some other results. Maybe they do. But on the ground, it changed nothing. If it did anything, it made the Palestinians much more at ease with continuing with their terrorism, because, you know, they get support from a respected country like Sweden. Sweden did not even try to stop them. We haven't heard, after the recognition, we haven't heard an official voice from Sweden calling to the Palestinians, stop with the terror. Have you heard it?
No.
There wasn't. But we were promised that now that Sweden has recognized Palestine, Sweden will have leverages over the Palestinians and things would be better. But I haven't seen this used. I haven't seen this used for a purpose of, you know, stopping such terror that is not even called Palestinian terror.
Don't you think that this, there could be a reason? Could it, after decades and decades of very simplified reasoning about the situation in the Mideast, Swedish population and Swedes in general have become indoctrinated in a too simplified way to look at the Mideast situation, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that it's so simplified just that these poor people, the land was stolen, and now come these, it's a kind of, how should I say, collective European guilt. These people that are almost like us, they come down there and steal. I think this is a very unfair way of looking at it. But can't you see that this could be one of the explanations?
Well, maybe, but it doesn't change the results.
No, it doesn't change the results for you.
The results are that the only democracy in the Middle East, the State of Israel, is judged harshly, is demonized by Sweden, including official Sweden, and the Palestinians and other countries in the region, with much worse practices to their own citizens, okay, are giving, you know, a carte blanche. That's, you know, we don't see that. But with Israel, you know, there is a balance, and we are a sister democracy to Sweden. Open your eyes, people here. Open your eyes. The audience, it's not only you and me, it's Swedes. You should look into reality and understand that the terrible terror which we suffer for decades, and we said decades ago that it's not only Israel, this is beyond Israel. And this is a plague that would reach other countries too. And we were, you know, laughed at the time because it seemed a kind of an Israeli way to get out of this Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We suffer today, Sweden and Israel, we suffer from the same thing. We are in it together. I keep saying it, we are in it together. We are in it together in the sense of Islamism, extremism, getting to us just because our style of life. We are an outpost of the Western societies, the free world in the Middle East, a region that is dominantly ruled by Muslims. And by being this front post, we pay the highest price. But this is us now.
You feel betrayed by the Western world?
To a large extent, yes.
You feel betrayed?
Very much so. Look at the number of condemnations we get in the UN. You know, we have 3 Secretary Generals already, including the acting one now, that is saying it as we speak, time and again. The demonization of Israel and the discrimination of Israel in the UN in general and its agencies should stop. Okay? That's what he says. You know, the Secretary General of UNESCO, the same organization that Sweden was the only European country to support a terrible resolution regarding Jerusalem and how Jerusalem is not Jewish. The same organization, its Secretary General says, I'm ashamed of my own organization. I don't feel comfortable with my own organization. Which shows you how this whole system is dragged and being used politically by the Arab Islamic group that takes other countries along to get any resolution they want passed against Israel. And the free world, instead of standing up to its principles, what too many of this free world are doing is collaborating. And Sweden was the only one collaborating in the last instance, which I don't think gives any pride to Swedes at all.
Maybe Sweden is in the lead of this behavior, but still isn't it a tendency generally in the Western world the last 4 or 5 decades? I was thinking, it's not only Sweden, I was thinking, for example, of France, that up to the end of the 60s, I think 67, had a very extensive military collaboration with Israel, but it had finished the exporter, French arm exporter, weapon export to Israel. Isn't this a tendency, like yourself, you're implying, that is seen everywhere in the world?
Well, I can agree with you that there is criticism of other countries towards Israel, but I think Sweden took it to the extreme. I think that you mentioned France. France, when we are talking about UNESCO, the last in 1 year, 3 resolutions regarding Jerusalem. The first one, France supported, and the president said, we're sorry, it was a mistake. And they never repeated it. Sweden supported and repeated it the last time, the third resolution, being the only European country, namely Germany, Italy, Great Britain, all those are, not countries that could understand the depth of this resolution. Apparently, Sweden does. And Sweden said that the other countries broke a consensus. Well, when I see one country voting as Sweden did, and the others are voting differently, I think it is Sweden that broke the consensus, not the others.
You are soon leaving Sweden. And are you going back to Israel then, or
yes.
You served to another post?
I'm going to Israel. The system in our foreign ministry, but not only ours, in many of them.
You made
most of them.
Tours back to the foreign ministry.
You serve 4 or 5 years the most in a destination or 2 consecutive years, and then you come back to refresh your experience in your own country. So you'll be able to represent it again later on.
Where did you serve? Which countries before Sweden?
This is the 6th country already.
Yeah?
I started in Burma. When I started, it was Burma. It changed to Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And I was there for 3 years and then continued to Uruguay.
Uruguay?
I was number 2 in both countries. And then after Israel, going back to Israel, after those 2 missions overseas, I went again to Brazil. To Brasilia. I was number 2 in our embassy in Brasilia. And from there, I continued to Bolivia. I was ambassador in Bolivia. And after 5 years in Israel, I went again overseas to Guatemala. Mm. And now I'm here. And in between, I did different jobs in the ministry, including before coming here.
So there's quite a dominance for Latin America.
Yeah.
So you picked up Spanish.
Yes.
We exchanged a few words in Spanish. Fala português também?
Falo português também.
Ah, sim.
Falo.
Oh, bueno. Bem. Ele é muito bem. I think it's. I'm forgetting. I don't speak those languages that well. Just a few words. But you think when you came to Sweden, did you expect this?
Yes and no. The thing that took me by surprise, and that I still don't live in peace with this, is the fact that it's very complicated to advocate Israel in Sweden. It is complicated to me as an ambassador, and I'm paid for doing that. Okay, it's complicated to me because the media is almost blocked for the Israeli mainstream story, and we worked hard on that in the embassy with the social networks. Things are better. I think that in the time that I've had here, we opened some of them to our messages. But I still think that it's tough. The Swedish media doesn't actually give the necessary attention to other versions than those that are very accepted in Sweden. Mm-hmm. There's no pluralism when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. This is a conflict that is a standalone conflict, disregarding events in the Middle East. All the Arab Spring, all this doesn't exist. I mean, I'm exaggerating. But still, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is beyond all the rest. This is the conflict that goes from one administration to the other and is adopted by the Swedish DNA, so to speak, to continue for eternity. And
I don't think so.
I think
I don't agree with you there, but
okay.
Let's return to that.
You have the right to disagree, but what I see is much less public attention here to the Syrian conflict, the internal one.
Yep.
On all fold, there were four times the number of casualties in the Syrian 5-6 years old conflict than in the Israeli Palestinian conflict ever since. And still, the attention it gets publicly here, I don't see the public so devoted in debates, in panels. It happens, but if you look at the magnitude of what happens there and what happens with the Palestinians, it's amazingly marginal compared to the Palestinian story in Sweden. Now, I'm not marginalizing it. We want very much to solve this problem. But, Palestinians are divided. Half of them say they want peace, and we have to believe them because sometimes they say it out loud in Europe, and back in Ramallah they say some different things. The other half is obviously saying, no way. In Gaza, no way. So before having one Palestinian state and one leader to discuss peace with, we have two. But still, we are blamed for not collaborating and not negotiating. Even if you'll push me to negotiate, now, I'll negotiate with Abu Abbas, the president, okay? This is a president that can deliver. I mean, Sweden doesn't even call him to stop the firing from Gaza because he can't. So what kind of peace can we agree upon with a leader that hasn't visited for 7 years? Mm-hmm. 7 years his constituency in Gaza. He can't. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. So we will have a peace agreement signed with this leader. And what will happen the following day when fire will be shot and launched missiles from Gaza? We will stand idle and say, well, we have a peace agreement. We'll have to act. So we have to be realistic and look at the conflict for what it is, and not for what the Swedish model of the Middle East, on which Swedes are very much opinionated, is. The Swedish model of the Middle East is one thing. The reality is a different thing.
Excuse me for disagreeing with you, but I think that the solution of the roots of the conflict in the Middle East is hardly something we have to limit this interview to a more specific Swedish problems, because a little country like Sweden can't contribute much to solving your greater problems with your neighbors. But the conflict between official Sweden and official Israel. What is to be done about that conflict? That is, as I've seen, a more realistic and more down-to-earth problem for Swedes and for you.
Okay, first of all, we should have some proportion on this, you know, misunderstandings or debates that we have bilaterally. We are limiting this only to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the concepts that are different in Jerusalem and in Sweden vis-a-vis this conflict. But else than that, you know, we are doing great when it comes to commerce, trade, high-tech, innovation, academy. Things are running and are okay. Even on the political track. Just for you to know, in less than a month's time, there will be a Swedish high-ranking delegation from the Foreign Ministry going to our Foreign Ministry and having a political dialogue. Sweden and Israel would have a political dialogue in Jerusalem. And in last May 2016, I had a delegation coming from Jerusalem, high-ranking officials from the Foreign Ministry, and we ran a political dialogue with Sweden here. So things are happening. It doesn't happen with the high profile of a foreign minister visit to Israel. But, you know, the way we look at it in Israel is that the allegations as to the extrajudicial executions are still valid. Israel is blamed in wrongly and intentionally, you know, construing the Swedish statements in a negative form, and you know, with such allegations, such conduct, it's very difficult to have a kind of a dialogue in between ministers with a fruitful content. We should somehow have some better opening conditions for such meetings to take place. And you know, we follow the Swedish policies vis-a-vis Israel. We haven't seen anything that would alleviate the Israeli feeling that Sweden is not practicing a balanced policy. We have seen the last voting in UNESCO. There are some others that are not that familiar to the public in Sweden, but we have repeated reminders. You know, there was a special envoy nominated by Sweden for the conflict. You know, given the debates vis-a-vis the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that both capitals, Stockholm and Jerusalem have, you have mentioned it, to nominate a special envoy is a little maybe out of context. And especially when this happens without even letting us know. We have heard it for the first time like the Swedish public heard it. And we are supposed to collaborate with this envoy and to accept it. So I think that we have a kind of a repeated pattern of Sweden running policies when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that maybe are motivated by other interests than purely bringing about peace in between Israel and the Palestinians.
I was going to ask you about your contacts with Swedish politicians.
Yeah.
You seem to be very critical of the largest Swedish political party, the Social Democrats. But before continuing, ask about your relation to other political groups, I'd like to remind you, you seem to be very well read on Swedish politics and the results, the election results of the Social Democrats. But you mentioned a couple of times they had their own majority, more than 50%. But I'd like to remind you, which is kind of funny, that in those days when they were the strongest days of that party, the Social Democrats, then they were much more friendly towards Israel. So the image is not totally clear. I mean, it hasn't only to do with this party being big and strong and for many years being dominating, because in the years when they were mostly dominating, when they were totally dominating, they were much more friendly towards your state.
That's okay, but what I'm saying, that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know.
It's not, the party policies become the Swedish public views, that's what I'm saying. So if in a certain time the party thought A, most probably the public would think A. And then if after a few decades it was B, most probably it would be something that would be the concepts of the population.
Could it be the other way around? The media were reporting very positively during the 50s and the 60s
and if
about
they
Israel.
did, they did because of
and then they influenced the population,
maybe.
And the politicians want to. Well, it's not
thing.
exactly. It's an interaction.
It's an interaction led by the same party.
Yeah, but perhaps.
And by the way, you were asking me how I see
the other parties.
Party. Well, this is the biggest party. It's confusing to talk about the party as being a one party with one philosophy, because when it comes to Israel, you know, large circles in this party would not even see me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are.
And this is the center left.
Yeah.
It's not the left.
Yeah, but
so
there
in
are
the
still.
center, please.
Yeah.
In the center left, and this party, which is a dominant party, there are circles that would not see me. And I'll tell you that there are some that saw me, and I've been told by them later that they paid a price for that. So can you imagine?
Yep.
In the ruling party in today's Sweden, it is complicated for parliamentarians of this party to meet an Israeli ambassador when we are part, if not half, of this conflict that they are so much involved in. I think that this is something that should trouble, less troubling for me. And I think that in a democratic country, when a party is so critical to the point of not even listening to part of this conflict, the half of this conflict, in fact, something is troubling. And I'll tell you that with the left and the Green and the left parties, the situation is even worse than that. Okay? So when you see a ruling center-left, more or less ruling, because the left is not part, but generally speaking, okay, all the center-left in Sweden looks at Israel as you know, as a pariah, as a country that, you know, you can't even talk to their representative. It's terrible to listen to him. What they do is awful. Now, you're entitled to think that. You're entitled to your opinions. Yes. But I think it's troubling to see how close they are to even listen to what we have to say, because this sometimes is not along their narrative of the conflict. And even those that I've met from time to time listened, and they were polite, and it was a good meeting, but, you know, I couldn't even scratch their very solid opinions, and I think that too often those are opinions that are not based on realities and are not based on the right facts, and are based on a distorted view of facts, and many times on no facts.
But of course, they might have been wrongly informed. They might have been given wrong information.
But this is more so. If this is the case, they should meet me. They should happily meet me.
Yeah.
They should call me to meet me.
Yeah, and you mean that if they don't meet you, they cannot be well informed, and they won't have the other side of the argument. But
I don't mind them seeing other Israelis, but mainstream Israel. You know, even you have some research centers here. When they go to Israel to learn, they don't meet the right wing of Israeli politics.
No.
They go to meet their colleagues from the left. So what kind of a pluralism is this? And how come that Sweden is so much interested in what the minority in Israel thinks? I mean, would you think that just, you know, if I'll take the one party that is not accepted in Sweden, and I'll represent their views and their concepts as Sweden in Israel, would this be a real Sweden?
No, of course.
Okay, so this is what it is.
But what about your contacts with other parties? After all, the Social Democrats are only one of the three big parties.
No, that's
There are
what I'm
three
saying.
big, yeah.
That's what I said. With others, it's even more difficult.
Yeah.
We had meetings that were cancelled. You know, the SSU would not see us. Would not see us. We set meetings with SSU, with the Green Party youth leaders, and they won't see us. When we try to see parliamentarians, rarely they see us. Okay? And it's just for the sake of maybe not be caught as, oh, we won't see him. Okay? The contacts we have with those parties are minimal, and they come with concepts. You know, the Green Party with Fridolin and Kaplan. You know, they were involved in incidents in Israel, and they were expelled from Israel. Okay, for being involved in what they think is a great contribution to peace, but it was incitement at the end of the day. Okay.
But hasn't it occurred to you that this might be, well, I know this is not much of a comfort, but this might be a problem for us Swedes, even if you're of course hurt by it, your country and you representing your country, but it might in a way be a problem for the Swedes, an internal problem that we are not prepared to look in an objective way at things, and we are not prepared to be as democratic as we claim we are.
Well, first of all, yes, I think it should be something that would trouble Swedes. But the last question that you made, I partly answered, because beyond the politicians and the parties, there is the public, and we have many Swedes that are supportive to Israel. Many more than you can imagine. Honestly, I was surprised myself to see how many on an individual basis when I meet them. But they tell me at the same time that they are afraid and they are not at ease to talk about it and to express themselves loudly as supporters of Israel. Because in their social circles, in their work, in their fika, if there's people, if there are people that they don't know and they don't trust, they won't touch upon Israel. They would even listen to criticism of Israel, thinking otherwise, and they would say nothing because it might be harmful. This is a very troubling situation. If people cannot be in a minority voice and to express themselves, and when it comes to Israel, it seems to be very, very much so. It goes to the media, it goes to politicians, apparently, as I mentioned, and it goes to the public, in general public. I came across many that would tell me that they don't feel that they can do that, though they would like very much to do that. This is not a social, healthy climate for a pluralistic society to be really open. I limit myself to Israel. I don't like to touch upon other subjects. When it comes to Israel, yes, this is an injustice that is caused to the state of Israel as a result of, you mentioned it as indoctrination. I would say a repeated narrative that became, the media is not covering, is not giving expression to today's realities as they are today. They are adapting into the narrative. There is a narrative here. And this creates a reality in which, apparently, maybe not only when it comes to Israel, Swedes are not at ease to be in a minority voice, and they prefer not to speak at all.
Thank you, Isaac. That will conclude the interview. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.